In 1973, when Roe v. Wade was decided, my mother looked at me and said, "That's some white woman nonsense right there." She said, "There's not a black woman in the world that would ever kill her child in an abortion center, not after our experience here in America." I thank God that my mother didn't live to see today. Because today, it's not 55 million, it's 60 million babies, 37% of which were black, were killed in an abortion center in this nation. So when ABC, A Better Choice, called me and said, "Will you come speak?" I'm like, "Oh, sure." So a few weeks ago, Molly called me and said, "Okay, so what you gonna say?" So I was in the middle of writing. I am writing part 2 to my book, The Fight for Life, Taking It to the Street. It's called The Fight for Life, Turning the Wounded into Warriors. So I start waxing eloquent. I think I'm sounding real good. And she smiled. I could hear her smile through the phone. And she said, "Wow, Catherine, that's great, but could you talk about this for me, please?" So if you go to sleep on the first part of this talk, it's her fault. But she wanted me to talk about how did we get here? How did we get to an America where 60 million people have died in an abortion chamber? She said, "Catherine, there are people that are coming that don't know how we got here. They've never heard the story. So in order to give you a better understanding, I have to take you back all the way to the 1800s and then bring you up to today. Is that okay?" Yes. So how many of you have heard of a man named Sir Francis Galton? We got 1 or 2, 3. How many of you have heard of Charles Darwin? Francis Galton was Charles Darwin's cousin. And he was as crazy as a bedbug in a rug in June. Because he sat somewhere in England and decided that the world was going to run out of food. And because we had too many people, we had more people than we had food to sustain the earth. And so he founded this pseudoscience. It's not science. It's out of the inner workings of the brain of a crazy man, called eugenics. And he said we had to do something to control the population in the world, not just in his country, but in the world. So then along comes his crazy cousin, Charles Darwin, who says that we need to preserve the favored races. So his cousin introduced race into the equation to say that there were certain races that shouldn't be allowed to procreate because they were feeble-minded or unfit or whatever other thing he conjured up in his mind. So that was over there in England. But what was happening in the United States was another crazy person who was as crazy as a bedbug in the rug in June. And her name was Margaret Sanger. And she was an angry woman. She hated the Catholic Church with a passion. She felt like the Catholic Church was forcing women to have children, and she wanted to do something about it. And so she formed a birth control league. And she became one of the leading eugenicists in the country. But she didn't just leave it there, because she did something that no one else in history did in terms of birth control and abortion. She identified by name the group that she felt should not be allowed to have children. She called it the Negro Project. And she and Clarence Gamble of the Procter & Gamble family fortune decided that they were going to launch this initiative to promote birth control in the community, in the black community. They were going to get black leaders. They were going to get black pastors to teach birth control from the pulpit. They found a willing participant in W.E.B. Du Bois. How many of you have ever heard of the Talented Tenth? The Talented Tenth was not a good thing. He said that only 10% of the black people should be allowed to reproduce and lead and be in leadership. And they began to go around the country and promote this idea that children should be limited based on the color of someone's skin. So Margaret Sanger wrote a letter to Charles Gamble, and she said that they needed to get some ministers because it might occur to some of our more rebellious members that they were trying to exterminate us. So I tell people all the time, I'm definitely a rebellious member because that's definitely what they tried to do. So that's the history of Planned Parenthood. Now, she changed the name from Birth Control League to Planned Parenthood after Hitler and the Nazis got taken down after World War II. And so eugenics wasn't quite as popular then, so they had to make it sound more friendly so people would want to engage in the birth control movement. So they changed the name to Planned Parenthood. And that was the beginning of the propaganda spin that we are facing in this nation today with regard to abortion. Okay. If you go to Planned Parenthood's website, if you talk to anyone that worked at Planned Parenthood or currently works there, they will tell you, oh, Margaret Sanger didn't like abortion. She didn't. She thought abortion was murder, and you're just confusing it. And oh, she was just a product of her generation. She wasn't really a racist. It's complicated. You just don't understand. It's complicated. She was for women. She was for women's rights. And, you know, we needed to be able to determine what to do with our body. And so she launched a campaign to first remove God from the discussion. Because the Bible said we're made in the image and likeness of God. And so she said, oh, no, we're not. It's just, you know, a blob of tissue. We haven't evolved yet in the stomach, you know. You should be able to self-determine as a woman. You should be able to decide to evenly space your children. No one should be able to tell you what to do with your body. She especially went to black women and said, you know, after slavery, don't you want to be able to control what happens to you? You know, the slave master used to rape you. And you can do something about it now. You can have control. And she actually found black ministers to begin to teach that message all around the country. And in the 1960s, she decided we need a pill, a hormone pill that would allow women to make that decision easily and safely. And so she spent her 3 husbands' fortune to help pay for the development of the birth control pill. Now, let's look at this issue of birth control and abortion. How could it be that we could go from a nation that everybody agreed back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s was founded with a biblical worldview? How could we get from that biblical worldview to you can take the life of your child in the womb? It happened through the courts because Margaret Sanger could not get the legislature, she couldn't get the Congress to go along with her. In fact, They wanted to lock her up, and so she fled the country for a number of years to avoid arrest because she was going around and giving women obscene material. Obscene material? Talking about birth control? Yeah, because the country had a law called the Comstock Law that made it illegal for you, a doctor, to give a woman birth control. They considered it immoral. They considered it obscenity. And there was a law that was passed in 1873 that said you cannot give birth control. It was considered murder. So what did Margaret do? She came up here to Connecticut. Now, I was born and raised in Connecticut, right down the road, a little piece in Stamford. Used to be a housing project there called Southfield Village. It doesn't exist anymore because it got so badly torn down. But it produced these fine women, so it had to have some good, right? But she came to New Haven, and she found her director, the director of Planned Parenthood in New Haven. Her name was Estelle Griswold. She found her and the medical director in that Planned Parenthood and got them to start dispensing birth control to women. And the court said it's okay. But let me back up a minute before I tell you about Griswold and how the court did that. The Supreme Court of the United States has been the most rights-denying body in this country. They have taken the Constitution of the United States and twisted it and manipulated it and turned it to deny us basic human rights. It started in the Dred Scott case. Everybody know Dred Scott? Yeah. They said Dred Scott wasn't a citizen because he had been a slave. So because he wasn't a citizen, he didn't have standing to sue. The Congress came back and said, nah, y'all are crazy. So they passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? 13th Amendment ended slavery. 14th Amendment said you have due process of law and equal protection. And the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to blacks. But the Supreme Court said, They came back with Plessy versus Ferguson that said you may be equal, but you're separate. So we had 99 years of legal discrimination from Plessy versus Ferguson until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In between there, they decided the Buck v. Bell case. Anybody know Buck v. Bell? Buck v. Bell said the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, and they gave the right to involuntarily sterilize women and men to the states. So for 90 years, we had legal discrimination, but we also had Buck v. Bell that allowed 33 states to set up eugenics boards, and those eugenics boards were quietly sterilizing women all around this country, like my friend Elaine Riddick. Elaine, when she was 13 years old, was raped by a neighbor. She got pregnant. When she had the baby, the state of North Carolina went to her grandmother, who could not read, and told her grandmother, if you don't put your X on this paper, we are going to take your welfare benefits from you. Grandma put X on the paper, not understanding that when Elaine delivered her son, they tied her tubes. Elaine didn't find out that they had sterilized her until she was 19, when she got married and wanted to have more children and could not because they had involuntarily sterilized her. And there were 64,999 other Americans that got sterilized like Elaine did. So these eugenics boards were all across the country, and if they decided that you were feeble-minded or that you were illegitimate, or, they had this list that was random, then they could involuntarily sterilize you legally. But what started happening in the 1950s and early 60s was the culture shifted away from tolerating legal discrimination against a person based on the color of their skin. So you had Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old boy who had gone to Mississippi to visit an uncle, and the KKK tortured him to death in 1955. His mother had an open casket funeral in New Jersey because she wanted the nation to see what hate looked like. You had the sit-ins, you had the bus boycotts going on, and then you had the bombing of the church where 4 little young black girls were killed in Birmingham. And the country said, no, that's not America. Enough. But what did the Supreme Court do? They said Griswold v. Connecticut. So while we were marching across the Pettus Bridge and John Lewis got clocked upside his head, right? The court decided Griswold. And they created something that they called a penumbra of privacy in the Constitution. If you go read your Constitution, there is nothing in the Constitution today that says anything about a right to privacy. It is not in there anywhere. They created a fiction, and they started with married couples, and they struck down the Comstock law saying that married couples had a penumbra of privacy, so they should be able to get birth control. 7 years later, while the country was still reeling from the fact that you could now contracept, which many believed was murder in and of itself, they decided Baird v. Eisenstadt, which now said all these single women who are having illicit sex on the side should be able to contracept too, because they have that same penumbra of privacy. And then they came back 1 year later in 1973, and they said, we have Roe v. Wade. You can legally kill your baby. Now, what's interesting about that decision is if you go and read it, the Chief Justice inserted race and poverty into the decision. Now, the case came out of Texas. It didn't have anything to do with being black, white, pink, or green. It had to do with a state having the right to say that you cannot kill a child in the womb. And they struck that case down using the 14th Amendment that was designed to give black people equal protection and due process of law, right? To say there was a penumbra of privacy and you could now kill your baby. What most people don't know is that there was a companion case to Roe v. Wade. So Roe v. Wade said in the first trimester, it's not really viable. And so until it reaches a stage of viability, you can terminate the life of that child. The companion case was Doe v. Bolton, decided the very same day as Roe v. Wade. And that case said, well, the mother's mental health is important, so you can take the life of the child after the first trimester. So in many states across the country, you can be 9 months pregnant, and if the doctor that you have is an abortionist, you can say, I don't want this baby, and you can kill it. And it's legal here in the United States. Jen, I'm sorry, turn my phone off, please. That's my phone, that's a shame. And so that brings us to where we are today. We have a concerted effort in this country to limit the lives of some people based on the color of their skin. The Negro Project is alive and well, and it is happening all around us. How do I know? Because 3% of America's population are black women of childbearing age. 37 to 39% of the abortions in this nation are on black women. Planned Parenthood, the chief architect of abortion on demand, because after Margaret Sanger stepped down as president, they got Alan Guttmacher, who was the vice president of the American Eugenics Society, and he's the one that redefined a woman's health to include her mental health. He became the president of Planned Parenthood, and he is the one that launched the initiative on abortion on demand all the way up to 9 months. And so they started their initiative. They did the Negro Project. They still pay black ministers to preach and teach birth control and abortion from the pulpit. They pay black entertainers, doctors, whoever they can get to sing that message into the black community. And you know what? They're not trying to hide it. You know how I know they're not trying to hide it? Okay, so this past June, we did the Selma Project. And in July, the Center for Medical Progress released these videos to the horror of some people, not all people. And those videos showed Planned Parenthoods selling baby body parts. And every time Cecile Richards, the president of Planned Parenthood, was asked a question about selling baby body parts, she led off by saying, if you take the $500 million taxpayer dollars from Planned Parenthood that they get every year, poor women and women in communities of color won't have access to reproductive health care. She went before the Congress of the United States of America and said, if you take our money, poor women and women of color won't have access to health care. Now let me back up a minute. In 2012, a colleague of mine, Arnold Culbreth, was working for an organization called Life Issues Institute, Protecting Black Life. And so we had been saying all around the country that Planned Parenthood has deliberately located their centers in black neighborhoods. And they said we were lying, right? They said that less than 40% of their centers are in communities of color. But what Arnold did was take the 2010 census data, and then he looked at Planned Parenthood surgical facilities. And the results that he found was that 79% of their surgical facilities are within a 2-mile walking radius of a black or Latino neighborhood. And that is by design. 79%. But we know that there are other non-Planned Parenthood abortion centers too. And let me just tell you, those centers are filthy. One of the things that Roe v. Wade did was set up the expectation that these women were going to get counseled by their doctor. Do you remember the phrases between a woman, her God, and her doctor, right? So they set up this picture that this doctor, you know, this cherubic-looking, chubby-cheeked doctor who just loves women was going to give her the best counsel on what to do. And they were going to operate under safe, legal, clinical standards. That's what's in the Roe v. Wade decision. In 2009, a young woman by the name of Kannemeyer Mongar was killed in an abortion center at 3801 Lancaster Avenue in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The DEA was also monitoring that abortionist because he was running a pill mill. The DEA went in, they waited until like 8, 9 o'clock at night because they wanted to make sure that he didn't have any patients in there. And they went into that center and they were horrified at the smell, at the raw filth, at the fact that this abortionist had body parts of babies that he had saved on shelves in the refrigerator where the staff kept their lunch. They found out that he was birthing the babies alive and snipping their necks with a pair of scissors afterwards. And the abortion industry said, oh, he's an outlier. He's an exception to the rule. But what we have found is that is not the case. If you go to Guttmacher's website, you will see a little teeny tiny footnote that says about 5% of the abortions result in an injury that requires the woman to go to a hospital for care, right? 5% of 1.2 million is 60,000 women a year are having their bowels ripped out, their uterus is perforated, they are being given infections because of unclean instruments. The list is long and huge of the women that are being hurt. And they're not just black women. Young 29-year-old Jennifer Marbelli was a kindergarten school teacher, went to this quack named Leroy Carhart, who has a facility in Maryland and in Nebraska. And he told, well, let me just say this. 99% of the women getting an abortion never talk to the doctor beforehand. There's no counseling. And until he is between her legs doing the procedure, she doesn't even see him. So she goes to Leroy Carhart, and only God and the angels know what he did, but Jennifer didn't come out alive. Tanya Reeves, vibrant young 22-year-old, 5 months pregnant, went to a Planned Parenthood in Chicago, Illinois. They perforated her uterus. Rather than taking her the few feet down the road to the nearest trauma center, they left her there for 5 hours. They scraped her uterus an additional 2 times trying to fix the botched abortion. By the time they got her to the hospital, it was too little too late and she died. Lakeisha Wilson went to preterm abortion center in Cleveland, Ohio. 22 years old, had a heart attack. The facility was not ambulatory surgical center compliant, so the elevator was broken. So they had to bring her down out of that abortion center on stairs. But even if it had been working, it wasn't big enough for a gurney, so they couldn't begin life-saving procedures on her until they got her downstairs. They brought her out naked from the waist up. Too little, too late, heart attack and died. Samika Shaw had her uterus perforated and she got sepsis. She died curled in a ball on the floor of her home. And when her aunt ran for office herself, and she was a Democrat, ran for office, but she voted in Pennsylvania to raise the standards to ambulatory surgical center levels, Planned Parenthood launched an attack against that aunt to try to unseat her. Some of you may have heard of Wendy Davis. Does that name sound familiar? Wendy, the state of Texas did a law that said if you're going to do the surgery of abortion in Texas, then you have to meet ambulatory surgical center levels, and you have to have admitting privileges to the hospital. How many times? Admitting privileges to a hospital within a 30-mile radius of where you're practicing. That makes sense, right? Wendy filibustered the bill. She talked for 11 hours, and the bill got defeated. Governor Rick Perry called a special session of their legislators and said, y'all ain't go home until you pass this bill. They passed the bill. They are fighting it tooth and nail, saying that if the abortion centers are required to raise their standards to ambulatory surgical center levels, poor women and women in communities of color are not going to have access to reproductive health care. The case is at the Supreme Court right now. Christina went to Washington, D.C. to pray, and the abortion proponents attacked her, surrounded her, were threatening towards her. The same ones that rose up in Georgia when we put up the billboards that said black children are an endangered species, called Trust Black Women. Well, yeah, trust black women. Trust all women to make the right decision. Give them all the information. If you really are about choice, then you will tell me the truth about what's going to happen to me when I go in that abortion center, right? But what they're not telling you is that women are dying. What they're not telling you is that women are being involuntarily sterilized. What they're not telling you is that most of these abortion doctors shouldn't even be practicing because they're so old. They're 70, 80, 90 years old. What they are not telling you is that these abortion centers don't clean the instruments, and so they're passing diseases. They don't tell you about the epidemic of STDs that are ravaging our young people today. It's an epidemic. Google STDs at the CDC, and you will see in big, bold letters, epidemic. What they don't tell you is that you are elevating your risk for breast cancer. There is a direct link between abortion and breast cancer. There is a direct link between abortion and the premature birth rate that this nation is experiencing. The United States has the highest premature birth rate of any country. What they don't tell you is that the back alley abortionist simply put on a suit and tie and walked in the front door of these abortion centers. Or he's doing the abortion out of his car, like the two doctors that got arrested, one in South Carolina, one in Nebraska. Or the one that wasn't even a doctor, he said he learned how to do abortions on YouTube. This is what abortion is in the 21st century. And what we must do is change the culture. We have to make it unthinkable for anyone to choose to terminate their pregnancy. Now, how do we do that? Well, I'm all about the black pastor. Because I think when black women wake up in this fight and join their Caucasian sisters on the front line, it's over. It's over. They won't be able to lie to us anymore about what's going to happen. So that's one. But we have to support and establish a safe path for women to be able to come forward. There are women sitting in our churches every Sunday who are suffering silently because they can't tell anyone that they chose to terminate their pregnancy. There are very few women in the country that are like me that will confess that I was stupid and I had 2 abortions. And Christina mentioned it. when women have one abortion, you have to, 54% of all the abortions done in this country are repeat. And what they're not saying is that women are suffering mentally, they're suffering spiritually. They don't know that Jesus loves them and they can be healed because we're not telling them. But if we support the Pregnancy Center movement, that's what the Pregnancy Center movement is. It's a safe path. It gives women the information that they need. Do you know that more than 90% of the women that see the ultrasound choose life? Because we know it's a baby. We know it's not a blob of tissue. We know that. We just want someone to come alongside us and encourage us in that. Will you help create that safe path by supporting ABC? Will you dig deep? Now, I subscribe to a whole bunch of email thingies, and there was one that said, "Good Black News." I said, I definitely need to subscribe to that one because, woo, there's some bad black news out there. So I'm reading the Good Black News. Now, some of the stuff that they thought was good black news wasn't good. But I'm reading the Good Black News, and I see that this foundation has committed $90 million to reach girls and women in communities of color. I said, oh good, let me apply. I need some of that 90 million so I can go around here and stop abortion. So I dig a little deeper. I don't qualify to get that money because I don't support population control and I'm not a feminist. So I can't get it, but they will give it to someone that will go and lead black women and Asian women and Latino women into those abortion centers. So we have to be able to combat that. Now I know, well I don't know that. Maybe one of y'all have a foundation in here that can give 90 million, like Warren Buffett's foundation did. But I know Jesus. And I know he can multiply the fish and the loaves. So we have a whole bunch of people in here. And I'm going to pull on you tonight to give. I know God told me, so I want to convict y'all, that there are at least 50 of you in here that can give $1,000 tonight. You can either write the check or more. You could decide to be a leader and give $10,000. But you can give up that caramel macchiato at Starbucks that you drink every day and give that money to the Pregnancy Center. Commit to give that $1,000. And I'm serious about this. Now, if we were in a black church, I could do that black pastor thing good. I can make y'all line up. Raise your hand if you the one, because you know God's telling you to dig deep. But I'm not going to do that. But I am going to ask you to do something as a believer. We are the salt and the light. We have to make a sacrifice to fight this evil. I'm going to ask you to commit to tell somebody what I told you tonight. But I'm going to ask you to dig deep and give. And I honestly do believe that there are 50 people here that can give 1,000. Will you write that check? Maybe you can only give 500. Will you write the check? Maybe you can only give $5. Now, y'all got to do better than $5. But that meal was worth more than $5 that we got. But seriously, I don't want to make light of this. This is an urgent hour. Their testimony touched me so deeply because ABC got to them with the truth. They had a safe path to make an informed decision and not to yield to the pressure of the pro-abortion culture. They made a decision to believe the truth of God over the lie. And if ABC hadn't been there, what would have happened? I am so full because it's been 43 years. We can't take another 43 years to end this. We don't have another 43 years to fall on our faces before God and say, we're sorry. But will you join tonight? Now in your packet, you got a card. I want to ask you to take a moment right now and fill out that card and give. And table hosts, I want to ask you, once they give you that envelope, I want to know, did we get the 50,000? Because I don't want to play. My book is The Fight for Life, Taken into the Streets. So while y'all are writing these checks, I want to give y'all a little testimony. I grew up in Southfield Village. I told you about that. It doesn't exist anymore. But I used to fight every single day. Because back in the day, if you beat up one person, you know, back then we had big families. 13, 14, 15 children in a family, right? So if you beat one, you have to go through the cousins, the aunts, the brothers, the sisters. And you'd be so tired, you'd be back at the beginning, fighting. And so when I got saved, you know, I had to stop fighting because, you know, back then, if you looked like you wanted to fight me, I was going to hit you first. Because I knew if the person who threw the first punch was the one that was really going to win the fight. And if I didn't hurt you with that first punch, I knew to run. Because that meant that you were tougher than me. But this fight for life, we must fight it differently. We can't sit in our churches and in our homes and not respond to this challenge. We can't do that. Lives are at stake. Lives of the babies, lives of the mothers, lives of the dads are at stake. And Jude 22 says, sometimes you got to go snatch the people out the fire, because they're not going to just come. You got to go snatch them. Will you help A Better Choice pave that path so that women in Connecticut, where Griswold v. Connecticut was decided, that said that we can contracept, will you help them stem the tide? The last thing that I'm going to say, the pregnancy center movement in this state is under attack right now. The abortion industry published a report last year that lied. It was a 27-page lie. It was the greatest work of fiction since The Lord of the Rings. That's my favorite book. but it was all a fiction because they want to stop them from being able to get to abortion-minded women. They're going to launch a bill next year to try to shut down A Better Choice. Will you come street fight this with us? Will you let A Better Choice turn the wounded into warriors by making that safe path for them to come? I want to thank you all so very much. I say God bless you.